The morning Daniel Whitmore found the old photograph tucked inside a library book, his entire understanding of the last 20 years cracked down the middle like a fault line giving way beneath a city that had no idea it was built on borrowed ground. He hadn't been looking for anything. That was the cruelest part. He'd simply reached for a copy of Great Expectations from the shelf in his late father's study, a room he hadn't entered since the funeral 3 weeks ago, and when he'd pulled the book free, a small photograph had slipped from between the pages and drifted to the floor like a leaf releasing its grip on autumn. He picked it up, and the world as he knew it stopped making sense. The woman in the photograph was young, early 20s, perhaps, standing in front of what appeared to be a grand estate he didn't recognize. She wore a cream-colored dress that spoke of a particular kind of wealth, the quiet, understated kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Her dark hair was pinned elegantly. Her posture was straight in the way that daughters of important families are trained from childhood to stand. And she was laughing, a full, unguarded laugh, at something just outside the frame. He recognized her laugh before he recognized her face. Because that laugh had filled his house for 20 years. The woman in the photograph, young, radiant, dressed in the clothes of the wealthy, was Elena, his housekeeper. Daniel Whitmore set the photograph down on his father's desk with the careful, deliberate movement of a man trying very hard not to react to something that was making every nerve in his body fire at once. Elena Vasiliev had come to work for his family the year his wife, Catherine, had died. That was 20 years ago. His son, James, had been 4 years old. His daughter, Sophie, had been 2. Daniel himself had been 31, newly widowed, running a company that was in the middle of the most aggressive expansion in its history, and completely, terrifyingly alone with 2 small children who needed more than he knew how to give. Elena had appeared. That was the only word that seemed right, looking back. She had simply appeared. She'd been referred by an agency. Her paperwork had been immaculate. Her references had been glowing. She'd arrived at his door in a plain grey coat and sensible shoes, her dark hair pulled back simply, her expression composed and warm, and within 48 hours his daughter Sophie had stopped crying at night for the first time since her mother's funeral. Daniel had given Elena the guest suite on the 2nd floor, a salary that reflected how much he needed her, and, he was ashamed to admit this now, very few questions. He had been grateful. He had been desperate. And Elena had asked for nothing more than the opportunity to take care of his children. For 20 years, she had done exactly that. She had helped James with his science projects and attended every single one of Sophie's school recitals. She had learned to cook the specific macaroni and cheese that Sophie would eat during the phase, lasting nearly 3 years, when Sophie would eat almost nothing else. She had driven James to soccer practice at 6 in the morning and waited in the cold parking lot with a thermos of coffee and a novel until practice ended. She had sat with Daniel in the hospital waiting room when James had broken his arm at 14, not because he'd asked her to, but because she'd known he would need someone there. She had become, without anyone quite deciding it, the quiet center of their family. Now Daniel was staring at a photograph that said she was something else entirely. Something she had never told him. Something she had, in fact, taken great care to conceal. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in his father's handwriting, his father, who had apparently known something Daniel did not, were 4 words. She is a Vasiliev. Daniel didn't confront Elena that day. He wasn't ready. He needed to understand what he was looking at before he walked into a conversation he couldn't walk back out of. He spent the afternoon in his father's study, going through the old man's papers with the focused intensity he usually reserved for corporate acquisitions. His father, George Whitmore, had been a businessman of the old school, meticulous, controlled, and possessed of a habit of keeping information to himself until he deemed the moment right for its release. Daniel had inherited the first 2 traits. The third had always frustrated him. Now it terrified him. The Vasiliev name was not unfamiliar to Daniel. It was, in fact, one of the most significant names in the history of European finance. The Vasiliev family, originally Russian nobility who had rebuilt their fortune in Western Europe after the Revolution, then multiplied it across 3 generations through banking, real estate, and energy, were one of the wealthiest and most reclusive dynasties on the continent. They gave no interviews. They attended select events with curated visibility. Their patriarch, the legendary Nikolai Vasiliev, had died approximately 22 years ago, leaving behind an estate valued at the time at somewhere between $8 and $12 billion, depending on which financial publication you consulted, and a succession crisis that the business press had covered with barely concealed hunger. Nikolai had 2 children. A son, Alexei, who had inherited control of the family's European operations, and a daughter, whose name, Daniel now realized he had never seen in print. Every article about the succession had referred to her only obliquely, as the daughter, or had noted simply that she had withdrawn from public life following her father's death. Daniel opened his laptop. He began to search. It took him 2 hours and several paywalled financial archives to find what he was looking for, And when he found it, he sat very still for a long time. The Vasiliev daughter's name was Elena. Elena Vasiliev. She had been 23 when her father died. There had been a very brief, heavily redacted account of a dispute over the estate, something about a contested will, allegations of pressure applied by Alexei's legal team, a settlement reached in private. And then she had simply vanished from every record. No property in her name. No business filings. No society appearances. No photographs after a certain date. She had disappeared so completely that Daniel, who had spent the last 20 years sitting across the breakfast table from her, had never once connected the composed, practical, deeply capable woman in his kitchen to the vanished heiress of one of Europe's greatest fortunes. He picked up the photograph again. The cream-colored dress. The grand estate. The unguarded laugh. Elena. Downstairs, he could hear her moving through the kitchen, preparing dinner with the quiet efficiency that had been the backdrop of his life for 2 decades. The familiar sound of cabinet doors, the low murmur of the radio she always kept on while she cooked, classical music, always, a preference he'd never thought to question, the particular rhythm of her footsteps on the tile floor that he could identify in the dark. He knew her footsteps. He had lived in the same house as this woman for 20 years and he had not known her name. Daniel pressed his fingers to his eyes and breathed. There was a knock at the study door. "Dinner in 20 minutes, Elena said through the door. Her voice was exactly as it always was, warm, composed, carrying that faint trace of an accent he had long ago placed vaguely as Eastern European without pressing further. "I made the lamb. I thought you might need something substantial today." She thought about what he needed. She always thought about what he needed. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out normally. He was a man who had spent 30 years in boardrooms, and whatever else was happening inside him right now, his voice came out normally. Her footsteps retreated down the hall. Daniel looked at the photograph one more time, then placed it carefully in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest, and went to wash his hands for dinner. The Whitmore family dinner table had always been Elena's domain in a way that was never quite acknowledged but was universally understood. She did not eat with the family as a rule. That had been the arrangement from the beginning, a boundary she had established and Daniel had respected without question. She prepared the meal, served it, ensured that everything was as it should be, and then retreated to her own dining area near the kitchen. This had been the arrangement for 20 years. But tonight James was home. James Whitmore was 24 now, lean and focused like his father, with his mother Catherine's eyes and a directness of manner that could wrongfoot people who expected young men of his wealth and background to be softer. He had flown in from London for his grandfather's funeral and had stayed on, sensing, with the particular attentiveness he'd always had, that his father needed him close right now. Sophie was in Tokyo. She was a correspondent for an international news organization, a career choice that had startled and then deeply impressed Daniel, and was expected back at the end of the week. James was already at the table when Daniel came down, and he was talking to Elena, who was setting the serving dishes in the center with her usual precise care. "I just think you should come to the memorial," James was saying. "You were as much a part of his life as anyone. You should be there." "I'll think about it," Elena said, which was what she always said when she meant no but didn't want to discuss it. "Elena." James said her name with the particular inflection of someone who had been having a version of this conversation since childhood and had not yet found the right angle to win it. "You practically raised me. You don't have to keep pretending you're just the—" "The lamb will go cold," Elena said pleasantly, and set the last dish down, and was gone from the room in the way she had of moving that was so quiet and unhurried that you only realized she'd left when the space she'd occupied felt slightly different. James watched the doorway. Then he looked at his father, who was sitting down and unfolding his napkin with the slightly too careful movements of a man managing something internal. "She always does that," James said. "Does what?" "Disappears before the sentence is finished." James picked up the serving spoon. "I've been trying to get her to come to Grandpa George's memorial properly, sit with us, not stand in the back, and she just deflects." "She's private," Daniel said. "She's more than private," James said. "She's like a—" he paused, searching for the word. "She's like a closed door. A warm, incredibly kind closed door. But still." Daniel said nothing. "Did you ever wonder about her?" James asked, spooning lamb onto his plate. "Like, who she was before she came here. She never talks about her family. Never takes holidays to visit anyone. Never mentions a hometown. I used to think, when I was little, that she'd appeared out of thin air." He paused. "Sophie and I used to joke that she was a guardian angel who'd taken human form because she didn't know how to go back." Daniel picked up his fork. "When you were little," he said carefully, "did you ever hear Grandpa George say anything about Elena? About where she'd come from?" James looked at him. "Why?" "Just wondering." James thought about it. He said once, I must have been about 12, he said, that woman has more grace than anyone I've ever known, and she came by it honestly. I always thought he meant that she was just naturally graceful. Like it was a personality comment. She came by it honestly. Daniel held that sentence in his mind and turned it over slowly, like a stone in a river current. Dad, James said, watching him with Catherine's perceptive eyes. Is everything okay? Long day, Daniel said. Eat. He waited until James had gone to bed. Then he went to the kitchen, where Elena was finishing the washing up, and he sat down at the island counter. The same counter where she had helped James with his homework for years, where Sophie had learned to bake, where Daniel had drunk his coffee every morning for 2 decades across from this woman, and he placed the photograph on the surface between them, face up. Elena had her back to him. She was drying a serving dish with the slow, thorough movements of someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely. The silence stretched. Then her hands went still. She didn't turn around immediately. She set the dish down on the drying rack with the same careful precision with which she did everything, and she set the towel down folded, and then she turned around. Her face, when she saw the photograph, underwent something Daniel had never seen it do in 20 years. Something moved across it, fast, like a shadow crossing a wall, and then it was still again. But the stillness was different now. It was the stillness of effort, not the stillness of peace. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked at him. Where did you find this? Her voice was steady. Of course it was. In my father's study. In a book. He paused. He wrote on the back. She didn't ask what it said. Which meant she already knew what it said, or what it would say. Elena, Daniel said. And then, very quietly, Vasiliev. The kitchen was absolutely silent except for the low distant murmur of the radio, which had moved from classical into something slower and more plaintive without either of them noticing. Something shifted in Elena's expression. Not collapse, nothing as dramatic as that. More like a long-held breath that had finally been released, carrying with it the weight of years. How long has he known? She asked. I don't know, Daniel said. Long enough to write it down. Long enough to keep the photograph. He looked at her. Why didn't you tell me? She pulled out the stool across from him and sat down. Another thing he'd never seen her do, sit across from him in this kitchen as an equal, rather than moving around him with purposeful grace. Up close, in the kitchen light, she looked exactly as she always did. Dark hair, now with silver in it. Fine-boned face. Eyes that were almost black, attentive, and, he noticed for what felt like the first time, careful. Always careful. Watching what they gave away. 20 years. If I had told you, she said slowly, you would have had questions. And the questions would have led to answers that would have put you in a position you didn't need to be in. She paused. When I came here, I was trying to disappear. I needed to disappear. The simplest way to disappear is to become exactly what people expect you to be. She glanced at the photograph briefly. Nobody looks twice at a housekeeper. That's not an answer, Daniel said. That's a strategy. Yes, she said. It was. He studied her face. The estate dispute. Your brother. That's why you disappeared. Her chin lifted slightly, the first involuntary tell he had ever seen from her, and he had been paying close attention for 20 years without knowing it. Alexei, she said, and something in the way she said the name was like touching a scar. He contested my father's will before it could be probated. He had, she stopped. He had significant resources to bring to bear. And I was 23, and I had just lost my father, and I did not have the stomach for what it would have cost to fight him. So you walked away from everything. I walked away from a war I didn't want to fight. She met his eyes. I didn't walk away from everything. She glanced around the kitchen. The clean counters. The dish rack. The particular domestic geography of a life lived in service to other people. I chose this, she said, with a quiet weight that made the words land differently than they would have from anyone else. It wasn't a consolation prize. I was 23 and I had just lost my father and my world had just tried to swallow me whole, and someone offered me a quiet house and 2 small children who needed someone to be steady, and I chose it. She looked at him directly. I chose your children, Daniel. And I don't regret it. The use of his first name, she used it rarely, usually defaulting to formal patterns that he had always assumed were professional habit, stopped him for a moment. But you lied to me, he said. For 20 years. I withheld the truth, she said. I didn't actively deceive you. That distinction might matter more to you than it does to me right now. She accepted that without deflection, which was perhaps the most surprising thing she had done yet. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it does." The radio shifted again. The kitchen felt smaller than it usually did, or perhaps it was just that the usual distance between them had been folded up without permission, and Daniel wasn't sure what to do with the space that remained. "Elena Vasiliev," he said, saying it fully for the first time, and watched something move in her expression at the sound of her real name. "What are you worth?" She looked at him steadily. "In terms of the family estate? Nothing, legally speaking." Alexei made certain of that. A pause. "In terms of what I managed to preserve and invest independently over 30 years? More than you'd think. More than you've been letting on. Considerably." Daniel leaned back. The photograph sat between them, the young laughing woman in the cream dress looking up at the ceiling from her position on the counter, unbothered. "Did my father know from the beginning?" he asked. The pause before she answered was slight but measurable. "No," she said. "He found out, later. About 8 years after I came to work here. He found an old photograph, much like you did, in a different context." She paused. "He confronted me. I told him the truth. And he made a decision." Another pause. "He kept my secret." "Why?" She looked at him with the expression of someone choosing words from a private collection. "Because he said that whatever I had been before, what I was in his son's house was something of value. And he didn't want to damage it." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "And you trusted him," he said. "Yes. But you didn't trust me." Elena looked at him for a long moment. And then she said something that broke 20 years of surface open like a stone through ice. "I trusted you completely. I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you wouldn't trust me." He didn't sleep well. He lay in his bedroom, directly above the kitchen where he'd just had the most consequential conversation of his life, and stared at the ceiling and tried to organize what he knew into something that made sense. Elena Vasiliev, daughter of Nikolai Vasiliev, one of the wealthiest families in Europe. She had given up her inheritance, or had it taken from her, at 23. She had come to work in his house as a housekeeper. She had raised his children. She had cooked his meals and managed his household and sat with him in hospital waiting rooms and attended school recitals, and she had done all of this while carrying a secret that, if known, would have changed everything. Not because Elena as a housekeeper and Elena as a Vasiliev were different people. He was beginning to understand, lying in the dark, that they were not. She was the same person. The warmth was the same. The steadiness was the same. The particular quality of her attention, the way she watched people, understood what they needed before they said it, and moved to provide it with no ceremony, that was the same. But the why was different. She hadn't stayed for 20 years because she had nowhere else to go. She hadn't stayed because she was dependent on the salary, or the security, or the roof over her head. She had other resources. She had, apparently, more than you'd think. She had stayed because she had chosen to stay. And the question that was keeping Daniel Whitmore awake at 49, staring at the ceiling of the house his father had given him, was not who is this woman but something quieter and more unsettling. Why did she choose us? He was up before 6, which was not unusual, but he came down to the kitchen earlier than normal, which was. Elena was already there. Also not unusual. She was always the first person awake in the house. She was standing at the counter with a coffee cup, looking out the window at the garden in the grey early light. She was wearing her customary plain, well-made clothes, dark trousers, a cream blouse, her hair up as always, and she was completely still in the way that she sometimes was in the very early morning, when she didn't know anyone else was watching. She turned when she heard his footstep. Something crossed between them, brief, wordless, the specific acknowledgement of two people who have said things to each other the night before that cannot be unsaid. "Coffee," she said. "Please," he said. She poured it. He sat at the counter. They were quiet for a moment in the particular way of people who have known each other long enough that silence does not need to be filled. "What happens now?" she asked. It was the first time in 20 years she had asked him that. She had always been the one who knew what happened next. "I don't know yet," he said. She nodded, as if that were a reasonable answer. "Then, I'll understand if things need to change." "Do you want things to change?" he asked. She looked at him. And in her eyes, those careful, attentive, give-nothing-away eyes, he saw something he had never looked for before because he had never known to look. He saw that she was afraid. Not of him. Not of the revelation. Not of whatever came next in the logistical sense. She was afraid, he realized, of losing this. This kitchen. This house. This family she had chosen and tended and held together with quiet hands for 2 decades. "No," she said, very simply. "Neither do I," he said. He looked down at his coffee, then back up at her. But I have more questions, he said. I know, she said. And I want real answers this time. Yes. All of them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down on the stool across from him, the same stool from last night, the small revolution of a gesture, and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. All right, she said. Outside, the garden was emerging from the grey. The first birds had begun. The house was still and warm and familiar, holding 20 years of a life that had just revealed itself to be something more layered, more complicated, and possibly, though Daniel was not yet ready to examine this word too closely, more precious than he had known. There's more, Elena said. Her voice was quiet and careful, and the way she said it sent a cold thread of something down Daniel Whitmore's spine. He looked at her. There's more you need to know, she said. About why I came here specifically. About your father. About why. She stopped. Started again. About why it was your house. Daniel set down his coffee cup. It wasn't the agency, she said. I chose your family, Daniel. From the beginning, I chose yours. And you need to know why. The kitchen was very still. Tell me, Daniel said. Elena looked at him for a long moment, with 20 years of carefully held truth standing behind her eyes, and then she opened her mouth to speak. The story doesn't end here. If you want to see what happens next, comment part 2 below. If this video gets enough support, I will bring the next part for you very soon. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share the video.